The morning sun was barely peeking over the Montana mountains when Harold Bennett first noticed the rumble. At 93 years old, his hearing wasn't what it used to be, but even he couldn't miss the thunderous roar of motorcycle engines that shattered his usually peaceful Tuesday morning. He pulled aside his worn checkered curtains, the same ones Martha had some 30 years ago before cancer took her, and peered out his living room window. The small diner next door, Lucy's Corner Cafe, had been a quiet neighbor for the past 4 decades. But 3 weeks ago, new ownership had taken over, and things had started to change. Now, a group of leather-clad bikers had claimed it as their regular meeting spot, turning the once peaceful corner of Pine Street into their unofficial headquarters. Harold watched as more motorcycles pulled into the diner's parking lot. Their chrome pipes gleamed in the morning light, and their engines seemed to compete for who could make the most noise. The old veteran counted 12 bikes today, more than yesterday. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars from his war days, trembled slightly as he gripped his morning coffee mug. Living alone had its challenges, but Harold had managed well since Martha's passing. His small white house, with its perfectly maintained garden, and American flag flying proudly by the front door, had been his sanctuary. Every morning followed the same comfortable routine: coffee at 6, breakfast at 7, followed by light gardening or reading his worn copy of the local newspaper on the porch. But now, these bikers had disrupted everything. Their loud conversations carried across his yard, filled with rough language that made him wince. Empty beer cans occasionally rolled onto his property, and the constant revving of engines made his afternoon naps impossible. Harold's cat, General MacArthur, had taken to hiding under the bed whenever the motorcycles arrived. Mrs. Thompson, his neighbor from across the street, had stopped visiting for their usual Wednesday afternoon chess games. "Those rough men make me nervous," she had confessed over the phone. "Maybe we can play at my house instead," but Harold didn't want to leave his home. This was his territory, the place where he and Martha had built their life, raised their son, and welcomed their grandchildren during summer vacations. One particularly loud engine backfire made Harold jump, spilling some coffee on his clean flannel shirt. He watched as a tall biker with a long gray beard pointed at his house and laughed, nudging his companions. They'd all turned to look, and Harold quickly stepped back from the window, his heart racing like it hadn't since his days in the service. The local sheriff, young Jimmy Carson, though at 93, everyone seemed young to Harold, had stopped by last week after Harold called about the noise. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett," he had said, shuffling his feet awkwardly on the porch. "As long as they're not breaking any laws, there's not much we can do. Maybe try talking to the new diner owner." But Harold had already tried that. Sarah, the new owner, was a single mother trying to keep her business afloat. The bikers were paying customers, and in a small town like theirs, she couldn't afford to turn anyone away. "I'll ask them to keep it down," she had promised, but nothing had changed. That evening, as Harold sat in his favorite armchair, the one Martha had roof-holstered twice over the years, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: helplessness. The feeling reminded him of darker days, back in 1944, when he and his unit had faced seemingly impossible situations. But back then, he had been young, strong, and surrounded by his fellow soldiers. Now, he was just an old man living alone, his medals from the war carefully preserved in a box in his closet, his strength limited to what his walker would allow. His son David had suggested moving to a retirement community in Billings, where they had activities and round-the-clock care. "You wouldn't have to deal with these problems, Dad," David had said during their weekly phone call. But as Harold watched the sun set through his window, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, he knew he couldn't leave. This house, this street, this town, they were all part of who he was. The framed photo of Martha on the mantel seemed to smile at him knowingly. She had always told him he was too stubborn for his own good. Little did Harold know that his greatest challenge since the war was just beginning, and the solution would come from the most unexpected place. The morning Harold first experienced direct harassment from the bikers started like any other. He put on his favorite navy blue military cap, the one with his unit's insignia still proudly displayed, and began his daily walk to Morgan's grocery store. At 93, these walks were more than just errands. They were his way of staying independent, of proving to himself and others that he could still manage on his own. The early October air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched beneath his careful steps as he made his way down Pine Street, his aluminum walker, decorated with an American flag sticker his great-grandson had given him, helped him maintain his balance on the uneven sidewalk. He had walked this route so many times he could name every crack in the concrete, every mailbox, every garden fence along the way. The trouble started when he passed Lucy's Corner Cafe. 5 motorcycles were already parked outside, their owners lounging against the diner's wall, coffee cups in hand. Harold tried to keep his eyes forward, maintaining the dignified posture that had been drilled into him during his military days. But he couldn't help noticing how they nudged each other as he approached, their grins turning mean. "Hey, Grandpa," one of them called out, a tall man with tattoos covering his neck. "That walker got a turbo engine." The others laughed, and Harold felt his cheeks burn. He continued walking, pretending not to hear them. Another biker, younger than the rest with a leather vest covered in patches, revved his motorcycle engine suddenly. The loud noise startled Harold, causing him to stumble slightly. His walker scraped against the sidewalk as he caught his balance, and the group erupted in laughter. "Careful there, old-timer," the young biker shouted. "Don't want to break a hip." More laughter followed, along with the sound of another engine revving. Mrs. Peterson, who was watering her flowers nearby, quickly went inside her house. Through the window, Harold could see her picking up her phone, probably calling the sheriff again. But he knew it wouldn't help. These men were careful to stay just within the bounds of the law. The half-mile walk to Morgan's grocery store had never felt longer. Every few minutes, a motorcycle would roar past him, deliberately loud, the riders shouting comments about his age, his cap, or his slow pace. Harold's hands gripped his walker tighter, his knuckles turning white. The military cap on his head, which had always been a source of pride, now felt like a target. Inside Morgan's grocery store, Harold took longer than usual selecting his items. His hand shook as he picked up a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. Betty Morgan, who had known him for 30 years, noticed something was wrong. "Are you all right, Harold?" she asked, her kind face creased with concern. "You look a bit pale. Should I call David to come pick you up?" "No," Harold replied firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "I can manage." But the walk home proved even worse. The group of bikers had grown larger, and they seemed to have made a game of his return journey. They took turns riding past him, each pass getting closer and louder than the last. One came so close that the wind from the motorcycle made Harold's cap fly off. As he slowly bent to retrieve his cap, using his walker for support, he heard someone shout, "World War II?" More like World War II slow. The mockery cut deep, not because of the poor attempt at humor, but because they were making light of something sacred to him. That evening, Harold sat in his living room, his untouched dinner getting cold on the TV tray beside him. General MacArthur, sensing his distress, had climbed into his lap, purring softly. The phone rang. It was his grandson Kevin calling from Seattle. "Grandpa," Kevin said after hearing about the day's events, "you don't have to put up with this. There's a really nice retirement community near us. You could have your own apartment, be close to family." Harold looked at the wall where Martha's photo hung, her smile as bright and warm as ever. Next to it was his old unit photo from 1944, showing him standing proud with his fellow soldiers, young men who had faced real bullies, real threats to freedom. Some of them never made it home. "No, Kevin," he said finally, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "This is my home. I won't be driven out by a bunch of troublemakers who don't know the first thing about respect." As he hung up the phone, Harold didn't know that his military training was about to come in handy in a way he never expected. The situation with the bikers had reached a breaking point by mid-October. Harold sat in Sheriff Carson's office, his walker parked beside the wooden chair, while the young law enforcement officer shuffled through a growing stack of complaint forms. The small office smelled of coffee and pine-scented cleaner, and a wall clock ticked away the uncomfortable silence. "Mr. Bennett," Sheriff Carson finally said, removing his reading glasses, "I understand how frustrating this is. We've got complaints from you, Mrs. Peterson, the library across the street, and even the elementary school teachers." He paused, running a hand through his thinning brown hair. "But they're careful, sir. They never quite cross the line into anything illegal." Harold's weathered hands tightened around the handle of his cane. "So we just let them terrorize the neighborhood?" His voice was steady, despite the anger he felt building inside. "Back in my day, this kind of behavior wouldn't have been tolerated." The sheriff leaned forward, his desk creaking under his weight. The most I can do is increase patrols in the area, but unless they actually break a law. He left the sentence hanging, and Harold understood the unspoken message. The law had its limits. Outside the sheriff's office, Harold noticed 3 of the bikers lounging against their motorcycles, watching him with amused expressions. They had followed him here, turning what should have been a private visit into another opportunity for intimidation. One of them made a mock salute as Harold passed by, causing the others to snicker. That afternoon, Harold's neighbors gathered in Mrs. Peterson's living room. The floral wallpapered room was crowded with concerned faces: Mr. Johnson from the hardware store, Betty Morgan from the grocery, and several others who had known Harold for decades. They had organized this meeting to discuss the biker problem, but their proposed solutions left Harold feeling more frustrated than ever. "My son knows a good real estate agent," Mrs. Peterson offered, passing around a plate of chocolate chip cookies that no one touched. "He could help you sell your house quickly, Harold, before the property values drop any further." Mr. Johnson nodded in agreement. "My sister lives in that new retirement community in Billings. Says it's real nice. No bikers there, that's for sure." Harold listened as his neighbors, one by one, suggested ways for him to retreat, to give up his home of 45 years. The same home where Martha had tended her roses until her final days, where his grandchildren had learned to walk, where every scratch on the hardwood floors told a story of his family's life. The final straw came when his grandson Kevin arrived unexpectedly from Seattle that evening. Harold found him standing on the front porch, suitcase in hand, wearing a worried expression that reminded Harold too much of Martha's concerned looks in her final years. "Dad called me," Kevin explained as they sat in Harold's kitchen. The sound of motorcycles revving outside punctuated their conversation. "He's worried about you, Grandpa. We all are. I came to help you pack. Maybe look at some retirement communities while I'm here." Harold watched as his grandson flinched at a particularly loud engine roar from outside. Kevin, a software engineer who spent his days in air-conditioned offices, couldn't understand what this house meant to a man who had fought in muddy trenches and seen the worst of humanity. "I'm not leaving," Harold said firmly, standing up from his kitchen chair with deliberate slowness. He walked to the window, where he could see the bikers gathered at the diner. Their leather jackets gleamed in the setting sun, and their laughter carried across his carefully maintained lawn. "But Grandpa," Kevin protested, "you can't live like this. These guys aren't going to stop. They're just going to keep making your life miserable until—" "Until what?" Harold turned to face his grandson. "Until I run away. Is that what you think your great-grandfather would have done when faced with bullies?" Kevin fell silent, his eyes dropping to the old photographs on the kitchen wall. Harold in his uniform, standing proud with his unit. The same uniform that now hung preserved in Harold's closet, medals still pinned to the chest. As the evening wore on, Kevin reluctantly prepared to return to his hotel. Harold stood at his door, watching his grandson's rental car pull away. The rumble of motorcycles still filled the air, a constant reminder of his current battle. But for the first time in weeks, Harold felt something stirring inside him, not fear, not anger, but the same determination that had carried him through the war. He just needed to remember how to be a leader again, even if his troops now consisted of only himself and his cat, General MacArthur. That night, after Kevin left, Harold couldn't sleep. He sat in his old recliner, General MacArthur curled up at his feet, while the steady ticking of Martha's antique clock filled the quiet house. The bikers had finally gone home, leaving behind their usual mess of cigarette butts and empty cans in the diner's parking lot. His eyes wandered to the old trunk in the corner of his living room. He hadn't opened it in years, but tonight felt different. With some effort, Harold pushed himself up from his chair and made his way over to the trunk, using his walker for support. The brass key was still where it had always been, taped to the bottom of Martha's favorite vase. Inside the trunk, beneath his carefully preserved uniform, lay his old military journals. The leather covers were cracked with age, but the pages inside still held the careful handwriting of a much younger Harold Bennett. He pulled out the journal from 1944 and settled back into his chair. As he turned the yellowed pages, memories flooded back. He found the entry he was looking for, his notes from when he'd been assigned to lead a particularly difficult unit in France. The men had come from different backgrounds. City boys from New York, farmers from Kansas, a few who barely spoke English. They had hated each other at first, fighting among themselves more than focusing on their mission. Leadership isn't about forcing people to follow you, his commanding officer had told him then. It's about showing them a better path. Harold had succeeded by finding common ground between his men. He discovered that the farm boy from Kansas knew how to fix engines, just like the mechanic's son from Brooklyn. The quiet Italian immigrant turned out to be an excellent cook, bringing the unit together over shared meals. By the time they reached Germany, his unit had become one of the most effective in their division. A motorcycle roared past his house, probably one of the stragglers heading home, and Harold looked up from his journal. A parallel suddenly struck him. Here he was again, facing a group of people who seemed hostile and unreachable. But were they really so different from his old unit? He spent the next few hours reading more entries, remembering how he had handled various challenges during the war. One story particularly stood out: how he had turned a group of resistant French villagers into allies by first understanding their fears and needs, rather than treating them as obstacles. Around midnight, Harold pulled out his old notepad and began writing. His handwriting wasn't as steady as it used to be, but his mind was sharp as he listed his observations about the bikers. He had noticed things over the past weeks: how they always ordered coffee from the diner but complained about the quality, how some wore veteran patches on their jackets, how the younger ones seemed to follow the lead of the older members. Know your audience, he muttered to himself, remembering another lesson from his military days. He had watched them long enough from behind his curtains. Maybe it was time to really see them, to understand what drove them, just as he had done with his unit in France. As the night deepened, Harold found himself drawing up what he called a tactical approach plan, not to fight the bikers, but to understand them. He smiled slightly, realizing he was using military strategy to plan a peace mission. General MacArthur jumped onto his lap, purring loudly. The cat had been his constant companion since Martha's passing, named after the famous general because of his proud strut and commanding presence. "What do you think, General?" Harold asked, scratching behind the cat's ears. "Ready for one more mission?" Dawn was breaking when Harold finally went to bed, his plan taking shape in his mind. The journal entries had reminded him of something important: that true leadership often meant doing the unexpected, taking the first step even when it seemed foolish or dangerous. He placed his old journal on his bedside table, next to Martha's photo. Her smile seemed different tonight, almost knowing, as if she approved of what he was planning. "You always did say I was at my best when I was solving problems," he whispered to her picture. As he drifted off to sleep, Harold felt more peaceful than he had in weeks. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for the first time since the bikers had arrived, he had a purpose again. He wasn't just a target of their harassment anymore. He was a man with a mission, and if there was one thing Harold Bennett knew how to do, it was completing a mission. What he didn't know was that his late-night planning session would lead to one of the most remarkable transformations his small town had ever seen. The next morning, Harold woke up earlier than usual. His joints were stiff from sitting up late, but his mind was clear. He moved with purpose as he pulled out Martha's old percolator coffee pot from the cupboard, the one she had always said made better coffee than any modern machine. The sound of the first motorcycles arriving at the diner drifted through his window as Harold carefully measured the coffee grounds. He remembered how Martha had always told him that her secret was adding a pinch of cinnamon to the blend. His hand shook slightly as he followed her recipe, but he managed not to spill any grounds. Next, he retrieved the cookie tin from the freezer. 2 days ago, his daughter-in-law had sent him a care package with Martha's famous oatmeal raisin cookies, made from the recipe he'd shared with her. He had been saving them, but today they had a more important purpose. With methodical precision, Harold arranged everything on his old wooden TV tray: the percolator, his best coffee cups, the ones Martha had bought at the church bazaar 20 years ago, and the cookies arranged neatly on her favorite blue willow plate. Using his walker, he carefully maneuvered the tray onto his front porch. The bikers noticed immediately when Harold settled into his porch chair. He could hear their mocking whispers and see them nudging each other. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted across his small front yard, mixing with the crisp morning air. "What's the old man up to?" one of them said loudly enough for Harold to hear. Another made a comment about him being crazy. Harold pretended not to hear them, calmly pouring himself a cup of coffee. The steam rose in the cool morning air, carrying the subtle hint of cinnamon. For 30 minutes, nothing happened except occasional snickers and revved engines. Harold sat patiently, sipping his coffee, remembering how he had once waited 3 days in a French farmhouse for the right moment to move his unit. Patience had kept his men alive then. It would serve him well now. Finally, the youngest biker, a lean man with a scraggly beard who couldn't have been more than 25, began walking toward Harold's porch. The others fell silent, watching. Harold could see them tensing, probably expecting him to rush inside in fear. Instead, Harold slowly poured a fresh cup of coffee. "Smells good," the young biker said, trying to sound tough but unable to hide his curiosity. Up close, Harold could see the military boots the young man wore, not fashion boots, but genuine service issue. "Martha's Special Blend," Harold replied calmly, holding out the cup. "Marine Corps." The young man's eyes widened slightly. "How did you?" "The boots," Harold nodded toward them, "and the way you walk. Some things never change, even after 70 years. The biker hesitated, then took the offered cup. His first sip made his eyebrows rise in surprise. "This is real coffee," he said, sounding almost accusatory. "Not like that dishwater they serve next door." "My wife's secret recipe," Harold replied, pushing the cookie plate forward. "The cookies are hers too, though my daughter-in-law made these ones." The young man took a cookie, and for a moment, the only sound was the quiet munching and appreciative sips of coffee. Harold waited, remembering how his commanding officer had taught him that sometimes the most powerful words were the ones left unsaid. "You served?" the biker finally asked, eyeing Harold's walker with its American flag sticker. Harold nodded toward his front window, where his shadow box of medals was visible. "World War II, 101st Airborne Division, jumped into Normandy on D-Day." The young biker nearly choked on his coffee. "You're a screaming eagle. For real?" Before Harold could answer, another biker approached the porch, drawn by the coffee's aroma and his friend's obvious amazement. This one was older, with gray threading through his beard. "Got enough for one more?" the older biker asked, trying to maintain a gruff exterior but clearly intrigued. Harold smiled, reaching for another cup. "Always enough coffee for fellow veterans," he said, noting the Vietnam veteran patch on the man's vest. "Though you might have to fight the young Marine here for the last cookie." As the morning sun rose higher, more bikers drifted over to Harold's porch. None of them would admit to being the first to try Martha's cookies, but soon the plate was empty, and Harold was pouring the last of the coffee into eagerly waiting cups. What had started as a tactical approach was becoming something else entirely, though Harold wasn't quite sure what yet. But as he watched the bikers listening to his story about learning to jump from planes, he remembered something else his old commanding officer had said. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is extend your hand to the enemy." As Harold finished sharing his story about parachuting into Normandy, Jake, the young Marine who'd first approached him, leaned forward eagerly. "But you mentioned something about motorcycles in the war, right? You wrote them?" Harold's eyes lit up. With some effort, he pushed himself up from his chair. "Wait here," he told the small group now gathered on his porch. Using his walker, he made his way inside to his study. From the bottom drawer of his old desk, he pulled out a worn leather photo album. When he returned, there were even more bikers on his porch, drawn by the increasingly friendly conversation. They quickly made space for him to sit down, something that wouldn't have happened just days ago. Harold carefully opened the album to a specific page. "There," he said, pointing to a black and white photograph. "That's me with my 1942 Harley-Davidson DLA. We called her the Liberator." The photo showed a much younger Harold, standing proudly next to a military motorcycle, his uniform crisp despite the obvious signs of battle around him. The bikers crowded around, their previous intimidating demeanor completely forgotten. "Is that an original 45 cubic inch flathead engine?" asked Mike, the older Vietnam vet with the gray beard. His eyes were wide with appreciation. Harold nodded, turning the page to show more photos. "Did messenger runs between command posts. That bike got me through some of the worst fighting in France. Had to fix her up more times than I can count, usually while under fire." "You fixed it yourself?" another biker asked, his heavily tattooed arms reaching carefully for the album when Harold offered it. "Had to learn. No mechanics in the middle of a war zone," Harold chuckled. "Martha used to say I spend more time talking about that motorcycle than I did proposing to her." The bikers laughed, and Harold noticed how different they looked when they smiled. Less threatening. more human, just like his unit in the war, once you got past the rough exterior. What happened to it? The motorcycle? Jake asked, handling the photo album with unexpected gentleness. Harold's face softened. Had to leave her behind in Germany. Military orders. Often wondered where she ended up. He paused, looking at the modern motorcycles parked next door. Bikes are different now. Faster. More complicated. But that sound, that rumble of the engine, that hasn't changed much. Mike nodded thoughtfully. You know, we got a few restored Doelets at our club. Not many people around who actually rode them in the war. He hesitated, then added, "Would you like to see them sometime?" Before Harold could answer, another biker spoke up. "Hey, my grandfather served in World War II, 82nd Airborne. Did you ever cross paths with them?" For the next hour, Harold shared more stories, each one drawing the bikers deeper into his world. They asked questions about the motorcycle's mechanical details, about the battles he'd seen, about the men he'd served with. Some shared their own service stories: Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam. Others talked about family members who had served. The morning sun grew warmer, and Sarah from the diner appeared with fresh coffee for everyone, her eyes wide at the sight of the formerly antagonistic bikers sitting peacefully on Harold's porch, engrossed in his war stories. "You should come to our next club meeting," Jake suggested suddenly. "As our guest of honor. We got some folks who'd love to hear these stories." The others nodded in agreement. Harold looked at the group around him, the leather vests, the tattoos, the rough exteriors that had seemed so threatening just days ago. Now he could see beyond that. He saw the military boots, the veteran patches, the way they handled his old photos with respect. Most of all, he saw the same look he used to see in his unit's eyes. The look of men who understood sacrifice and brotherhood. "I'd like that," Harold said, smiling. "As long as you don't expect me to ride there on my walker." The laughter that followed was genuine and warm. Mike stood up, adjusting his leather vest. "Don't worry about that, sir. We'll handle the transportation. With your permission, we'd be honored to escort you." As the bikers began to disperse, making plans for the club meeting, Harold looked at the old photograph of himself with the Liberator. He remembered what his commanding officer had told him about finding common ground. Sometimes that ground was in the most unexpected places, like the shared love of motorcycles and the understanding that comes from serving one's country. Little did Harold know that this was just the beginning of a remarkable new chapter in his life. The transformation in the neighborhood happened so gradually that most people didn't notice it at first. The bikers still gathered at Lucy's Corner Cafe, their motorcycles still lined up outside, but something was different. Instead of revving their engines to disturb the peace, they were keeping an eye on it. One morning, Mrs. Peterson was struggling with her heavy groceries when two of the bikers, including Jake, rushed to help her. She was so surprised she nearly dropped her bags, but their gentle handling of her eggs and bread soon put her at ease. By the time they finished carrying her groceries inside, she was offering them homemade lemonade. Harold's daily walks to Morgan's grocery store had also changed dramatically. Now, instead of being harassed, he found himself with an honor guard. Usually, it was Mike or Jake who would appear casually beside him, matching their pace to his slower steps. They learned to walk on his left side, as his hearing was better on that ear, and they always made sure to keep between him and the traffic. "Just getting some coffee, sir," they would say, but Harold noticed how they scanned the street ahead, making sure his path was clear. Other bikers would wave as they rode past, their engines quietly purring instead of roaring. The neighborhood children, who had once been scared to walk past the diner, now waved at the bikers. Some even started asking questions about their motorcycles, which led to impromptu lessons about motorcycle safety and the importance of wearing helmets. At the diner, Sarah couldn't believe the change. The bikers had helped her fix the wobbly tables they had once deliberately shaken. They cleaned up after themselves, tipped generously, and even started a weekend breakfast club where veterans could eat for free, paid for by the Bikers Club Fund. One Saturday morning, Harold sat in his usual spot on the porch, sharing coffee with Mike and a few other bikers, when a moving truck pulled up to Mrs. Thompson's house across the street. Before the elderly widow could even begin to worry about her new neighbors, 6 leather-clad bikers were helping the young family unload their furniture, carefully carrying boxes marked fragile and assembling the children's swing set in the backyard. The local sheriff, Jimmy Carson, stopped by Harold's house one afternoon, scratching his head in amazement. "I don't know what you did, Mr. Bennett," he said, "but those complaint forms have turned into thank you notes. The bikers even helped us organize a charity ride for the children's hospital." Harold just smiled, offering the sheriff a cookie. He knew that sometimes the biggest changes came from the smallest gestures, like sharing a cup of coffee or taking the time to listen to someone's story. The bikers had started calling themselves the Veteran Riders, and their leather vests now sported a new patch, a design that combined their old skull logo with military insignias from different branches of service. Harold's old unit patch from the 101st Airborne had been incorporated into the design, a tribute that brought tears to his eyes when they first showed it to him. They had officially made him an honorary member of their club, presenting him with his own leather vest, carefully modified to fit over his shoulders without restricting his movement. On the back, above the new club logo, they had embroidered the Professor, his new nickname, earned from all the military history and motorcycle mechanics he had taught them. Even General MacArthur, Harold's cat, had gotten into the spirit of things. The formerly skittish feline now sat proudly on the porch railing during the morning coffee sessions, accepting gentle scratches from leather-gloved hands and earning his own tiny leather vest, custom-made by one of the biker's wives. Harold's son David flew in from Seattle for a weekend visit, worried about his father's involvement with the motorcycle club. He arrived to find Harold in his garden, teaching 3 burly bikers the proper way to prune Martha's beloved roses. The younger men were listening intently, their usual tough expressions replaced with careful concentration as they handled the delicate flowers. "I don't understand it, Dad," David said later that evening. "These are the same guys who were terrorizing you a few months ago. How did you do it?" Harold looked out his window at the diner, where the bikers were helping Sarah close up for the night. Mike was carefully stacking chairs while Jake swept the parking lot clean of debris. The chrome of their motorcycles gleamed in the setting sun, no longer a symbol of intimidation, but of protection and respect. "Sometimes," Harold replied, touching the veteran's patch on his new vest, "people just need to be reminded of who they really are." 3 years had passed since Harold's first coffee morning with the bikers, and Pine Street was buzzing with excitement. American flags lined the sidewalks, and colorful banners hung across the diner's front declaring, "Happy 96th birthday, Professor." The sound of approaching motorcycles filled the air, but today it was different. Over 200 bikes were thundering toward Harold's house, riding in perfect formation. They came from all across the state, motorcycle clubs that had heard the story of the 93-year-old veteran who had transformed a group of troublemakers into community heroes. Harold stood on his porch, now modified with a wheelchair ramp the veteran riders had built themselves. He wore his special leather vest, freshly polished military medals pinned beside the club patch. General MacArthur sat regally beside him in his matching mini vest, watching the procession with feline dignity. The lead rider was Jake, now the club's vice president, followed by Mike, who had organized the surprise celebration. Behind them rode veterans from every conflict since World War II, their bikes decorated with flags representing their branches of service. The rumble of their engines wasn't threatening anymore. It had become a sound of honor, a rolling thunder of respect. Mrs. Peterson stood in her front yard, wiping happy tears as she remembered how afraid she'd once been of these same bikers. Now she was their official cookie commander, baking treats for their monthly meetings. Next to her, Sheriff Carson was filming the whole thing on his phone, proudly wearing a Veteran Riders Support member patch on his uniform. The bikers parked in a perfect semicircle around Harold's house, creating an honor guard that stretched down the entire block. Sarah had closed the diner for the private party, and the smell of barbecue and her famous apple pies wafted through the air. As the bikers gathered around Harold's porch, Mike stepped forward with a large package wrapped in brown paper. "Professor," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "we've been working on this for a year. Happy birthday, sir." Harold carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a meticulously restored photograph of him with his old military motorcycle, the Liberator. The bikers had tracked down the original negative from military archives, had it professionally restored and colorized, and built a custom frame from parts of vintage motorcycles. But that wasn't all. Jake wheeled forward a small model of a 1942 Harley-Davidson Dual, exactly like Harold's old bike, built to scale with working parts. The craftsmanship was incredible. They had worked nights and weekends to create it, using Harold's old photos as reference. "Now you can keep the Liberator with you always," Jake said, gently placing the model in Harold's hands. The celebration lasted all day. Children from the neighborhood played safely among the parked motorcycles, their parents no longer worried. Veterans shared stories, comparing experiences across generations. Mrs. Thompson taught younger bikers how to play chess on Harold's porch, while Sarah kept everyone well fed with endless plates of food. As the sun began to set, Harold looked out at the gathering. The veteran riders had grown into something far bigger than just a motorcycle club. They had become guardians of the community, organizing charity rides, helping elderly neighbors, mentoring troubled youth, and creating a support network for veterans struggling to find their place in civilian life. David, Harold's son, had flown in for the celebration. He stood next to his father, watching the bikers share stories and laughter. "You know, Dad," he said quietly, "when this all started, I thought you were crazy for not moving away. But you didn't just stand your ground. You changed everything." Harold smiled, touching the model of the Liberator. "Sometimes the best victories aren't won by fighting," he said. "Sometimes they're won by remembering that underneath all our differences, we're not so different after all." As if to prove his point, a young biker was helping Mrs. Peterson carry a tray of cookies, while another was teaching her granddaughter how to safely sit on a parked motorcycle. Mike was showing some kids Harold's old war photos, while Jake helped Sarah distribute birthday cake. The story of Harold Bennett and the veteran riders spread far beyond their small town. Other motorcycle clubs across the country began reaching out to veterans in their communities, creating similar programs and partnerships. What had started as one man's stand against harassment had grown into a nationwide movement of understanding and respect. As the evening wound down, Harold sat contentedly on his porch, surrounded by his unlikely family of leather-clad guardians. The setting sun painted the chrome of 200 motorcycles in brilliant orange and gold, and the American flags fluttered gently in the breeze. General MacArthur purred in his lap, and somewhere, Harold was sure, Martha was smiling. Sometimes the greatest battles are won not with fists or fury, but with coffee, cookies, and the courage to see the good in others.